Good morning, St. Luke's. I'm so thrilled that you are joining us this morning, and I have the honor of welcoming the Reverend Dr. Gabrielle Thomas. She is a professor at Candler and a priest in the Anglican Church, and she serves on the Archbishop of Canterbury's Theological Reflection Group, and she serves with a Orthodox group, speaking about reflecting on theology and pressing issues in the church and the world. And recently, she has written a book for the good of the church, Unity, Theology, and Women. And so bringing all of that together, and she's just a generally fantastic person. And she has been with us at St. Luke's several Sundays. I'm thrilled to introduce her to you all, the larger community. So welcome, Gabby.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I have to say, I've really enjoyed the Sundays that we've been at St. Luke's since we moved here. The three of you are a tremendous blessing. I come with my spouse, Matt, and yeah, we really enjoy ourselves there. So thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful.
We're glad to have you.
Thank you.
And so this morning, we wanted to focus in on this new book that you wrote, which was part of came out of a study group that you led. And you bring up the question about what is known as receptive ecumenism. Did I say it right?
Yeah, you did. Yeah. Do you want me to just very briefly summarize it? What's annoying is it's a really complicated title for something that's very, very simple.
Yeah.
So when we think about working with other traditions and ecumenical work, what generally tends to happen is there's two sort of streams. We've got faith and order, which is the stream that talks about dialogues, and we're always looking to what doctrines can we agree on. And it tends to get a little bit complicated when some of us would say, well, the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, and others would say the Spirit proceeds just from the Father, and complicated conversations about who Jesus Christ is and that kind of thing. So that's sort of the one strand that tends to go on. And then the other is what we then sort of tend to call faith and works, and life and works. And that's where we get together with different traditions to do the social justice stuff and the things that matter. And they're brilliant in their own selves, but what's going on with this third strand that's much newer and emerging is looking at what can we receive from other traditions. So very specifically, looking at, I'm just thinking myself from the Church of England, I might say, oh, look, we've got this thing going on in the Church of England around mission, and we would like to learn from you, the Methodists, or whoever we're talking to. How is it you do your mission? Is there anything we could, any gift we could receive from you that would help us with our current, I guess, questions, challenges? It's specifically acknowledging that no one tradition has everything it needs and is perfect and complete in itself, but that we need all of them, and that actually there's all sorts of gifts to receive from other people, because we haven't got it completely 100% right ourselves. And so that's where the receptive comes in, because it's receiving. And so it's thinking about ecumenism in the sense of what we receive from the other, in a nutshell.
That's just like the reading we have this coming Sunday from 1 Corinthians, that we are all one body, but many parts.
Exactly.
And the elbow can't do what the pinky can do. So that's receiving all the different gifts. Yeah.
I have a feeling we may hear this in the sermon.
I may be thinking about a sermon.
You might have just heard it in a sermon, church. Well, so one, we have to talk about that, but maybe we could start a little softer in this conversation, is that we're hoping that Gabby will be around and that you'll all get to know her a little bit at church, and this will be a good church community for her. So tell us about yourself. Where are you from? Why do you talk like that? What do you care about?
So I'm from England. just in case that's not very obvious. People find it really difficult to identify whereabouts in the UK I'm from, and that's because I've lived everywhere. So I grew up in a tiny rural parish in the middle of nowhere in a county called Gloucestershire, which is in the West Midlands. But then after I left for university, worked in London, up in the northeast in Durham. So we've been in the Midlands. I mean, there's almost nowhere that I haven't worked in England across across my lifetime. And then I'm here because, well, I mean, there's obviously a really long story to that, but I was working in Durham in the university, and I was already ordained by then and serving as a minor canon in Durham Cathedral. And I was just there on a 2-year post because academic life is full of very short-term temporary positions. And so I was on a short-term temporary position there for 2 years and looking for my next job. And then there was one that came up at Yale, and that was in Berkeley Divinity School. And it was teaching early Christianity, which was what my PhD was in, and Anglican studies, which I knew about because of being ordained and having learnt it. And so I applied for that job and got it. And that was also a temporary position. So I was due to be there for 3 years. And then there were a few different things. There was sort of a few options of which way to go next, back home, stay here, etc., etc. And then this job at Candler came up. And it was one of those where if somebody had written a job description for me, it was just one of those rare things in life. It doesn't happen a lot. And you think, oh, hang on, this is describing me, this whole thing, everything they want is what I care about. And so I applied for this one, and thankfully this is not a temporary position. So we're now based, hurrah, in Atlanta, which I'm very, very happy about. It's fantastic here.
Well, so glad you're here. So you bring back some fond memories for me. I'm a priest also. Most of my ministry was in the academic world, several institutions, 2 Episcopal seminaries in the country. And so I'm interested in your call, what feeds you in being in the academic ministry, so to speak, and why that choice? Why did you feel called to that work?
It's a really good question. And I think I'd rather give you the really honest answer, actually, than the sort of the glossy version.
That's what I want.
Because it was a sense of call that really needed a lot of people to bring out, mostly because of lack of confidence. So from a very early age, I've always been obsessed with just learning stuff. I mean, any stuff really. And I started out in school. I had this absolutely ridiculously brilliant Latin teacher. She was just really, really encouraging and really good. And so I went on and read classics to begin with, and was just completely obsessed with the sort of first few centuries of history and Christianity and that kind of thing. And was absolutely fascinated by it, but I didn't continue on. I then went and worked as a lay pastor, but the desire to study and learn never really left. And so when I started discerning for the ordination process, I had a conversation with my bishop, who was really pivotal in all of this, because I was telling him about a theology course that I was doing, and it was just a really reasonably basic introductory theology course that I was doing to just get myself back into studying again after years of working in a very different kind of world. And he just looked at me and he said, Gabby, he said, the way you're talking about this makes me think you should probably do a PhD. And I just said, I think I'm too old now, because I'd spent years working in outreach where I was working with women who are in sex work and in prisons and sort of advocacy kind of stuff. So really very different in some ways from doing a PhD. And so I thought, I can't, I was in my late 30s and I thought, I can't take this up now. This is just way too late. But he was my bishop, and he was a good bishop. I say was because he's retired now, but he was a good bishop. So I listened to him and took him seriously and thought, well, I'll think about it. So I went away and prayed about it. And I thought, what's actually stopping me? And it was really just the sense that, oh, I probably couldn't do that, and it's just something for other people to do. I hadn't grown up in the kind of family where no one else in my family went to university and nobody else has done PhDs, and it's just sort of not what we were about. So I sort of prayed a lot more, and then I went and spoke to the people who were running the theology course and said, you know, the bishop's just suggested this. Is this a crazy idea? What do you think? And it was one of those where every single step of the way, people said, no, we think you should do this. No, this makes absolute 100% sense. This is just sort of you. And I certainly wanted to do it. I loved it. I absolutely fell in love with theology the minute that we started. And so I pursued, I sort of did the way we work with the Church of England is you go through your normal discernment process, and then there's an extra discernment process, which is called theological education. So I went to college and started training, and then I went after a year through these further set of interviews with a panel of academic theologians who are also priests, and they're with you to discern, do we think this is the way that this person should go with their ministry? That route came back a firm yes. And then I applied for a further set of funding from the Church of England to fund the PhD. And I just stayed on in Nottingham, which was where I was studying for ordination. I stayed on there and then went to the university to do the PhD. And so that's sort of how it emerged. And to say it was a good fit is definitely, yeah, it works, it fits. But it to be honest though, Horace, it wasn't, it really was a community decision, I think is the best way of putting it. And I couldn't have done it without a lot of cheerleading from people who really believed that that was a route that someone like me could take.
Well, yeah, we talk about our call as the call of the community. So there you had it, and they discerned that your gifts really were in this academic world, and good for them and good for you. So if you could just kind of, this is a follow-up to what you just said. How have you found Candler, the students? What has that experience been like for you?
So, I mean, first of all, I mean, the students are fantastic. I think the reason that I love theological education in this particular world so much is I just love seeing people be surprised by being better at stuff than they think they are. I love being that person that calls out the gold in people that they just don't realize they have, right? That sort of one saying, oh, do you know, you just did that so well. And then, you know, a student looks at you and says, really? It's like, oh yeah, you're absolutely brilliant at that. Did you not realize that's a gift you've got? And then seeing people grow and develop in the sorts of things that you're pointing out. So that's partly why I enjoy this particular world, but also the connection to, you know, I'm training people who are going to go out and do different kinds of lay ministry, some obviously for being priests in the Episcopal Church. And so I think for me, it's that sense to, this is how I'm doing my bit in affecting the good of the church and the good of the world. Because I'm sort of building up those to send them out and equipping them, skilling them, teaching them, walking with them, crying with them when they need that. You know, I mean, we're doing life as much as theology here. I love being that person who accompanies people along the way. I absolutely love it. And so I sort of I don't see it. It's interesting because I remember listening to a talk from a principal once from a college saying, oh, it's sort of, I do miss being out there doing the exciting, edgy stuff. And I thought, I don't see it like that. So I don't see that I'm missing out on the exciting, edgy street work that I did, that there just isn't quite that same time for at the moment, because it's sort of joining the dot on all of the skills and experiences that I've had to be able to bring those into the classroom and sort of send them out, I guess as confident in who they are in Christ as it's possible to be within, you know, all the other competing things that they're hearing.
I have so many questions. I'm trying to figure out what the sensible way is to go. Actually, I have questions for Horace based on his questions, but Maybe we'll figure out how we do all this, because one of the things I heard was a much more sensible process for discerning gifts in the church in England than we have here. I cannot imagine a conversation with a committee that was supportive in the ordination process in this country towards both doctoral work and ordination. That's just not part of the culture that we have anymore. We used to have it. We just don't have it. I mean, unless, Horace, was your experience different than that?
I think I was fortunate to have that minority of folks in the Commission on Ministry and the Standing Committee in the Diocese of Chicago, because I remember one of the priests talked about this tradition of scholar priest, and actually celebrated that I was at that time a professor at Seabury Western Seminary in Evanston, Chicago land area, and really celebrated the gifts that I brought to the academic world as well as the parish. So, but I think you're right. We have moved away from that, and it's exciting to see you, Dr. Thomas, because you hold that tradition, which I think is rich, which drew me into the Episcopal Church. This value of education as God inspired and leading us toward the path that Christ calls us to.
And I don't know about you, Horace, but sometimes I get people saying to me, how do you juggle academic and ministry, as though they're two different things? And my reaction is, well, I don't. I mean, I'm always juggling competing needs for sure, but I mean, anyone is, you all are in whatever roles, your home, family, shopping, food, meals, whatever we're dealing with. There's always obviously competing work to be done and that kind of thing. But I don't see it as one paying off the other, because, until relatively recently in the church, this is what a lot of priests did anyway. It's not it shouldn't be a revolutionary idea for a priest to study theology. And yet somehow, because I would say the culture is definitely changing back in England too. I'm in the minority rather than the majority, that's for sure. Yeah, we're definitely going. There are competing claims about the direction we should go in the Church of England, and I think I was certainly more fortunate than others. My story wouldn't be everybody's story, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, I think it's a false dichotomy of academic world, parish world. Is kind of like spiritual and religious. I think one feeds the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Can you, and speaking of things that feed one another, what are the ways that your life as a lay minister and that work, which sounds so rich, has fed your academic work and your work as a professor and a priest?
So you wouldn't necessarily know it because I'm not explicit about it, but underneath everything I'm writing and teaching and thinking about, I'm asking the question is, which voice isn't heard? So with all of my, and I'm going to call them friends, because some of these people, the ones that are still alive, I still have relationships with. Some of my friends on the streets, their voices weren't heard anywhere other than within the context sometimes of our conversations on a Tuesday night. We'd go out, we'd take food out. I can't bear the kind of giving food to people as, so we would sit and eat with them. They would pray for us, we would pray with them. I mean, it was a really, really beautiful ministry that I felt incredibly privileged to be part of and leading. But I think what drove me to that work is, in the first place, is I just reading Jesus, really, just following the Gospels and seeing who he pays attention to, and that kind of thing, whose voice isn't heard in this place. And so the way, things like, if we're teaching Anglican history, then I'm not just going to teach all the white men who were important in the tradition. it's not rocket science really, and yet we're still at this stage where it's okay, so how do we weave in other voices? Because actually most of the textbooks the actual just easy handout to a student textbook, they're still really written according to the which white man did something important at this century, and then which white man did something important in that century. And so I'm always asking the question, where are the other voices here, and how on earth can I weave them into this story that I'm telling? And that would be true whether I'm reading 4th century theologians who are writing about the Trinity, right through to the book I was talking about with receptive ecumenism. So that's how that feeds that, because those times, we sort of had a church where they came in on a Monday morning, and it was just a different kind of church community, because not everyone was able to pay attention to the kind of service that we would have in the Church of England as we would have it St. Luke's on a Sunday morning. That was just never going to be an option for some of them. And so we sort of reimagined what might church look like if you haven't got a long attention span for various reasons. And that was just, well, it was fun and chaotic and crazy and mad and that kind of thing. But I sort of, that's exhibited, I think, though, through the way I am, even just in the classroom, like, which student didn't speak today? Are they okay? Why haven't they said something? Mm-hmm. Wherever it filters through, there's a thread, and it's to do with the voice on the outside.
I want to sit in your class, be in one of your classes.
I think lucky students, right? Yeah.
Well, next semester in the fall, I'm teaching our big introduction to history of Christianity. So you'd be very welcome to come along to some of those, Horace, and I'm sure you don't need to, but it's going to be a really fun course.
Well, I just, and I'm going to shut up, but you just, really singing my song. So I'll say one more thing. I love what you're doing. My question you answered. I was going to ask, you are in patristics in the church fathers, and then you're doing this exciting work on women in the church, and then the practical work you've done, and how you weave that into this kind of ancient world where women's voices were often silent. But you answered that, and I applaud that, because as we talk about language in the church and kind of beyond God the Father language, your work is so cutting edge, is probably, maybe not too strong, but I think you are a valuable resource as we in the church now, and parishes and dioceses are trying to navigate this tradition that we've inherited, which is very patriarchal, and realize how it silences most of the church, and how we now, many of us priests, want to honor the tradition, but also realize that there are some problems with the language and the tradition.
Yeah. And actually, my favorite church father that I spent most time working on and did my PhD on, he was one of the first advocates for saying that women were made according to the image of God. When a lot of the others at the time, this is a man called Gregory of Nazianzus, a lot of the others at the time were busy saying, oh no, of course they're not. And they were interpreting Paul in certain ways and that kind of thing. And he was big saying, no, you've got to have your divorce courts in the Roman laws. You've got to have this stuff right, because women are also images of God. And he's sort of, in his own weird way, pushing a few boundaries here and there. Not many, to be perfectly honest, but one or two that I found quite inspiring, because it wasn't how people were thinking at the time.
Well, and actually, importantly, John McGuckin was at Union. He was a Gregory scholar, right? You must know John. Yeah. Is that when we see language that is solely male in our liturgies, in the Episcopal Church, I think part of what we don't know, because it's not part of our intellectual heritage that we're connected to, is that's not just about inclusion of everything under a male term. It is about the debate of whether women are in the image of God and are of equal matter to men, right? And it's a debate that's lost to us, but we have the result. And so then when we work towards inclusion, because we don't have that original argument still in our imagination, it becomes a very muddy conversation. I think it's hard to have that conversation.
I agree. Yeah, incredibly.
So receptive ecumenism, we're going to talk about it. And I think I understand a little bit more about it now. So one, I'm fascinated that you are in a dialogue with the Oriental Orthodox Church, which is my heritage. My parents are from that community. My memory of that church growing up is, we have the doctrines we have, and wonderfully inclusive on the ground. Like when people are at your house at dinner, the priests and the bishops would say, of course, women should be ordained. Of course, equality, of course, we're the same. Really wonderful theological thinking, but that never occurred. That was not the reality of what the church was on Sunday and how the institution worked. And everybody had a reason. It was the lay people that were too conservative, or the bishops would say the priests were too conservative, or the lay people would say the bishops are too conservative. So one, I love that you're talking to them and in conversation with them. And I think people like me have always hoped that those conversations might lead to something like inclusion in those communities, that might be demonstrated. But it sounds like your work is that you've taken those conversations, which I'm sure can be challenging, and attempted to bring it, or brought in the voices of the people that are just not at those tables.
Yeah.
Really drawn up their voices. Yeah.
Yeah. So what we did, I mean, it was, oh gosh. I mean, it really was one of the, I've done lots of fun things, and it's really difficult because I always describe everything as, oh, this was the most fun thing I ever did, which makes it very, very hard to discern actually what did Gabby enjoy the most. So this was a really fun 2 years that I spent in Durham University, and I was hired just to basically run this research. And it emerged from a group of Catholic women who were inspired by the idea of receptive ecumenism. It had been sort of designed and crafted and developed by a Catholic theologian originally, a man called Paul Murray. And they'd been inspired by it, but they'd been sort of watching all the progress, and they were saying, well, it's all very well, but it's all going on up here, and there aren't many women up here in the Catholic Church. We're down here. So actually, how do we begin to think about what we do with this? And so they brought me into the conversation, and we had different groups across the UK of women from all different kinds of traditions. And the question we were looking at in those groups, but you could use it for anything, was really, what's it like working as a woman in your church? And we were listening to different women's experiences of working in Baptist church, Methodist churches, what it's like being ordained in one tradition and then not being ordained in another, that kind of thing. And I think what was really interesting across the board was that the wounds people were bringing to the table were all very similar, regardless of tradition. So women were often reporting problems with sexism, sexual harassment, and there was no one tradition that came out as, oh, well, this is the place to go if you want to be a woman and be safe. There just wasn't one. There were sort of really painful, difficult stories all across the board. It was the same for my women of colour who participated, that we didn't get one church in the UK where you can say, okay, this isn't racist. So apart from if you're Black and you go to a Black church, you're going to have a slightly different experience than if you're a Black person, a Black woman leading what's primarily going to be a white tradition. So we had some really, I think it was interesting for all of us, realizing that actually there's still a big problem with UK churches. It wasn't a Catholic problem or an Anglican problem or an Orthodox problem. And so what we were looking at was learning from each other how women had basically coped, survived, who'd left, who'd stayed. Why do you stay if you stay? Why not just leave? And we had some really fascinating conversations between, in one of the groups, there was a Pentecostal, and she was just saying to the Catholic, I just don't understand why you don't leave. And the Catholic was trying to explain the value for her of tradition. And so I think what was so wonderful about it is everybody's openness within those to just learn from one another. and to realize that there was something of value in each of those different traditions, despite the fact that there were also really big challenges. And everyone was very realistic about that. I think we somehow cultivated a very honest space where there was a lot of really real talk. So what was interesting in terms of where we got to with the method, the sort of way of being ecumenical itself, it's about 20 years they've been publishing on it for. And I think what those women brought to the sort of whole process was the importance of power in our dialogues and in our way of engaging that we don't always acknowledge. So the power dynamics between who's at the table. And that was something that was really brought to the fore that wasn't really quite acknowledged so much in the research at that point. And then the importance of place. So they gave great care to where we hold this conversation. If I'm a Catholic and I'm going into an Anglican space, that's going to be different than if I'm in a Catholic space. And what's the difference that space and our sort of religious sacred spaces make to how we're going to be in those places? And then the last one was prayer, because everybody's instinct was, well, we can't do this if we don't pray first. And then women were praying for each other at the end of it. And they were some really beautiful. It was one of, let me get it right. It was a Methodist holiness tradition. And the leader, she just said, right, I'm going to pray for everyone. And we were all in tears at the end of this, because it was a kind of prayer that not all of us were used to. And just the importance of prayer in this kind of conversation, when you're actually looking to learn from another, where you might have to acknowledge that your tradition isn't wholly perfect, and you're not just there to promote, but you're there to actually receive and learn. We were really very aware that we needed prayer in all of that.
So this brings together some conversations we've had at St. Luke's recently. So first, ecumenism, and these big dialogues, in my memory, are usually very defensive spaces, even if they're learning spaces, right? It's a place to say we think about Mary correctly, or we have the correct creed, the correct prayer book, and to try to find basically you're kind of trying to discern, is there anything in what we do that overlaps enough that we can claim it together?
Yeah,
right, something like that.
Yeah,
and this is doing the exact opposite.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, and that's, I think, what we found that women did particularly well, actually, at least in the groups, because you have to acknowledge that you've got to get your broken. So it's like if you've got a dinner party, usually we just tend to bring our best plates to the table, and everything well, at least I do. I mean, I don't currently because my stuff is still back in England, but in theory, I would have decent plates on the table. They would all match. I would have some nice crockery and that kind of thing. Whereas with this kind of approach, you just have to get your cracked plates on the table and just have someone over for dinner. People have got to see that there are broken aspects in every single tradition, and the defensiveness just doesn't get us anywhere. And so it's really acknowledging that defensiveness is a problem. It's a hindrance to ecumenical work and certainly to dialogue. But it does require humility. There's no doubt about it, because I'm definitely in my comfort zone if I know I'm right? Yeah.
Well, and then the question of power. So we had someone here earlier in the season, I guess in the fall, who was talking about one of your fellow professors at Candler, that he's older. It's kind of understood that we were bringing too many other categories into theology, and people aren't doing theology, which is also an ecumenical conversation, right? That if I understood him correctly, he was saying we're bringing in sociology and all kinds of other things, which is where you get a word like power, right? And so the theological word is authority, which is what you hear in a dialogue like that. But power is how we talk about our dynamics among one another, right? So what do you think about that?
So I would say power is a deeply theological word, because like all through, I'm thinking all through the New Testament, and certainly the guys that I'm reading are talking about the powers, powers and the principalities. So I guess I do think about it theologically, because there's a lot of language about various forms of power and how those powers are at work in our world. Although, I get that we tend to talk about it these days in sociology as well, but no, I'd hold firm for this is a deeply theological word, actually, because of how it's reflected more cosmologically, as well as just how we're interacting with each other. Although I don't have a well thought book on that in any way, shape, or form.
So I'm remembering my own experiences of being the only woman at the table, and still, that in especially in interfaith spaces, definitely in ecumenical spaces, and increasingly those are very hospitable tables. People are glad to have a woman. Their own tradition might not have a woman, or might, but many don't. But they're very, very gracious spaces. And my experience is that I get invited to do a lot of things because they would like a woman to stand there, including in India in these churches, like they'd like to represent this. So what's been your experience? Is there a move towards something, or is that something else?
So this particular dialogue, I think it was actually that it was it was less about me being a woman and more that they desperately needed an Anglican who understood the 4th century. And who they knew, because often as well it works on networks, doesn't it, in terms of who is known. So I think I actually don't know about the conversation that they would have had around, well, this is the first time we've ever had a woman on this dialogue. It's never actually come up, and unfortunately we're always on Zoom, so there's not the kind of hangout space to sort of have that kind of conversation as easily. But it's interesting, I'm trying to think. Most of the spaces that I'm in these days in the church world, I'm not sure if I'm being invited in because I'm a woman or it's because I can talk about a particular subject. I think 9 times out of 10, it's more to do with the subject. But I would say it's definitely more true in some of the academy. I wouldn't say that the space is always as hospitable. I've been at conferences and just through sort of pushing the boundaries a little bit with the way that I've translated Greek or that kind of thing, and referring to a human person as she once. And I've got some really, really very gritty stories that might not necessarily be for this morning's Zoom around what it's like being a woman at that table where actually you are not welcome or wanted. So I'd say I've got a mixed experience. Yeah, it's definitely mixed.
So I'm going back to how you were presenting these, creating these spaces and having these dialogues with the women. And what came up for me is something that I feel like we as human beings continue to need to practice and learn how to do, because I'm not quite sure we've actually learned how to do it, which is listening, practicing our listening skills, where we are listening to, as you would say, to receive, to hear, to understand, and not listening to defend, like go ahead and I think we have been so trained, probably through our education or whatever, that we've got to be prepared to defend our argument. And we haven't honed the skill to hear what's actually being said by another. How did you create kind of that space with those women?
It's a really good question. I think partly by modeling it, because I'm deeply aware of my need to defend everything. But I think I've always been someone who likes it. My intuition is always to fix things and defend stuff and that kind of thing. When I was working as a lay pastor, I actually did a 2-year counseling diploma, not because I had any intention of becoming a therapist. I definitely not going to be the thing that I was called into, but I wanted to learn to listen. And that's one way of actually learning the skill as much as the instinct to do it. So I think I probably, I mean, you know, I really picked up what people did with that and learned the skills and did the listening thing. So I think partly by just being very clear, by saying exactly what you've just said, Elizabeth, by, you know, laying out, well, actually our need is to do this, but what I'd love is for us to try and do this. But in those first instances, I gave women, I think it was 5 to 7 minutes to tell what they wanted to of their story and of their experience. And I prepared everyone beforehand, so no one was put on the spot or anything like that. I gave them about 3 months notice, I think. I said, you don't have to do this, but you know, if you'd like to use this space, you can do that. And no one was allowed to ask a question or interrupt. And so there was a sort of a space to which everyone just had to listen. And then, you know, afterwards we had the space then, especially for responding to. And so I think some of it's a discipline, and it's sort of about creating those boundaries in place so that if our instinct is to do something else, we've got a discipline helping us. And it wasn't 100% all the time. I mean, I wouldn't say we didn't have, you know, the defense going on at all, because I mean, we definitely did. But there was a sense to which there was a movement towards, I would say, yeah. And also because the whole thing was set up so that essentially, if you defended it, you got it wrong. And I think that helps. I mean, I think that's what's good about the process and the way that Paul Murray design receptive ecumenism is, you know, if you're sitting there selling your tradition, then you've got it wrong in the first place. And so everyone was there. They all wanted this whole project to succeed because, you know, we all wanted to honor the women who had worked hard to make it happen in the first place. Yeah.
So this might be too practical a question in some ways, but my experience of seminary was the same, of all of us having to defend why we remained in our traditions, preparing to be in a tradition that in which you would not be received, right? And one, it never occurred to me that to go anywhere else. It didn't make sense to me to be a part of any other church. But I have to say, I would not have said, because there will be room for me eventually. I just thought it's where I had to be. Now, my experience has been in 25 years, the church is very different than the church that I discerned for ordination in 30 years ago. Do you see this as kind of functional and practical, the process that these folks went through in terms of change in the church? Is that potentially an outcome of this kind of conversation?
I think it should be, if it was done well, yeah, and change for the better. So I'm just thinking an example of where we could be using it in the C of E is by listening to other churches that ordain a broader, I don't even know how to put it, but who ordain everyone rather than very specific people, groups and types and all the rest of it. So I think it has the potential, if it's done carefully and through prayer and with people who genuinely want to listen and learn, and who also understand their tradition and what's possible and what isn't. Because it's not about making it wouldn't be making us as Anglicans into Catholics or into Methodists. The whole point is we become more fully Anglican, more fully and wholly ourselves, rather than absorbing just something else. So it's that sort of careful tension between what actually fits within the integrity of a tradition, and then what's just something so other that actually that wouldn't make so much sense. But for example, the Spirit, if I'm thinking of the ministry of the Holy Spirit, it wouldn't be a crazy thing for Anglicans to listen to some Pentecostals on the place of the Spirit and the role of the Spirit. It wouldn't be a crazy thing for Anglicans to listen to Orthodox on the role of the Spirit and that kind of thing. I'm just thinking where there might be a room for improvement, shall we say, in in our communion, not all of the communion necessarily, but certain bits of it, in with regards to how we think about the Spirit, that kind of thing. But always change, I think, but still something you can recognize. So the goal isn't to become something else. Yeah.
Thank you. And then maybe to wrap up, because we're about to hit time, and connected to this language of the Spirit, which I think is very exciting. When I've heard of ecumenical conversation or conversation among people who disagree as Christians about difficult issues, right, the pressing issues, almost always I've heard that the approach is we use the Bible. We do textual study together because we have that in common. What I find interesting about what you're saying is you're using prayer as the piece in common. And I think that's really provocative and exciting and not bound to text, and also, and kind of bound to doctrine in interesting ways. Can you tell us about either how you came to that or how that's worked, or both?
I think I don't want to give the impression I don't think the Bible is unimportant, because that's definitely not true. But I think the problem is we still don't have a way of interpreting the Bible that we agree on, right? So most of us I'm certainly happy to, I pray biblical texts every morning, every lunchtime, every evening with the offices, all of that kind of thing. But I'm not necessarily going to interpret it in the same way as another friend who's reading the Bible. But I don't think it would be like that could even be a thing, is how are Anglicans reading the Bible, and how we learn from the Orthodox who are reading the Bible. How are our interpretation methods different? I think what's tricky for us as Anglicans is that's not even an answer we could give coherently as a communion. And I think that's possibly one of the reasons we're struggling within the communion, is because we don't have a coherent way of interpreting scripture that we would all agree on, is possibly my most provocative statement of the morning. But I think the reason prayer matters is because, yet again, it's a way of listening. If we're thinking of prayer not just as talking to God and asking, but also listening to the Spirit, but together. I'm not suggesting this is, one person's sort of job, but a community discerning, but in conversation all the time with scripture, with tradition, with, our church as it is today.
It's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for this conversation. We'll hear you in the pulpit. We'll hear you in front of the fireplace, and we'll get to know you over coffee as we're allowed to do that again soon. And congregation, you have to remember what the top half of our face looks like, because that's what you'll see when we're in church together, when we all have our masks back on.
And I'm short. People won't know this. I'm 5 foot. So don't look for someone who is tall.
So please do welcome her when you see her on Sunday, and we know we'll get to hear more from you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gabby.